Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I am Mark Orlando, and this is Building a SOC A-Team. So thank you all very much for joining this morning. Hope you all are all caffeined up and ready to go. So since we'll be spending the next hour or so, give or take together, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Mark Orlando, and today I want to talk to you about building SOC teams because this is a passion of mine. I've spent about 19 years in cybersecurity, mostly in security operations. And I've built or led or assessed security operations teams in a lot of different environments, a lot of different sectors at the White House, the Department of Energy. More recently, I was the Chief Technology Officer for Raytheon's cyber business. I spent a lot of years on the managed security service provider side and in managed detection and response providers. And I'm also the founder, co-founder, and CEO of Bionic, which is a blue team focused cybersecurity services firm. I'm also an instructor for SANS Sec 450 class, which is Blue Team Fundamentals and Security Operations. I'll be taking a few notes from that class and sharing them with you today. And I also happen to be an 80s kid, so I couldn't pass up the opportunity to drop in some cool 80s references here. That's why I'm going to be talking a little bit about the A-Team. Now, if you haven't seen the A-Team or are not familiar with that show, you're still going to get this talk. It's okay, just know that I feel sad for you and you should rectify that as soon as possible. But why are we talking about this? Why do I feel that this is something that rates some of our time today, is something that we need to address? Well, fundamentally, the biggest reason is that I hope we all agree that people, not tools, not fancy subscriptions or technology, but people will make or break your security team. You can have the best tools in the world, you can have the biggest security budget. If you don't have a great group of people operating them, you're not going to be operating at a high level. And more than that, good people are really hard to find. They're really hard to find. And if you can find them, they're really tough to keep and retain. They're tough to empower sometimes. And if you're trying to build up a team and create that A-team yourself, it can be tough to know where to prioritize your time and resources for things like training and team building out those interpersonal relationships. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And in my personal opinion, I think the traditional ops model that we have, this concept of security operations, where we're all sort of sitting in a room, maybe a virtual room, looking at events, opening tickets, kind of the more traditional way of doing things, that's not really optimized for the great people that we want to bring in. And I'll talk a little bit about why. Now, the titles of these next few slides fall firmly into the category of, if you're not familiar with the A-Team TV show, you may not get it, but that's okay. If you have a problem, and I think we all have a challenge of some sort, which is why you're tuning into this talk today, that problem is building SOC teams is a challenge. It's difficult. Why is it difficult? Oftentimes we have a lack of business alignment. We're not particularly well aligned to the organization that we're protecting. We might have data and tools challenges. Maybe we don't have enough, the right kind of tools, the right kind of visibility, or maybe we have too much, right? So much data, so many alerts, so many events, so many things to do that we can't possibly do them all in a reasonable amount of time. I already mentioned this outdated concept of this alert watcher. Right? We're all made to sit down and look at a queue of alerts, right? And that is the sum total of our focus as security operators. It's not really where we want to be. And I also think more of a systemic problem is this concept of sustainment. So if you've ever worked in a SOC or built a SOC or a defensive team of any kind from the ground up, you've probably been familiar with this concept of sustainment, where you have a phase where you're deploying tools and you're hiring people and you're building everything out. And then you get to a point where you feel like, okay, that's done. Right? My tools are deployed, I'm up and running, I have my SOPs, and now we just kind of go into this sustainment mode, ongoing operations, whatever you want to call it. And there's a tendency, and sometimes an organizational pressure, to kind of sit back and just kind of let it ride, right? Just watch those alerts roll in, follow your SOPs, right? And I'll talk today about why that is a problem and why that creates a kind of inertia that really goes against what we're trying to do in building those SOC A teams, those really high performing teams. And if no one else can help you, right? Fortunately, in our case, I think there are people out there that can help us. I don't believe that there is a talent shortage in security operations. I think that we have an expectations versus reality challenge in our industry. I think we have not been inclusive enough. We're not maybe looking in the right places. Again, if you have been fortunate enough to be able to see the formation of a security team from the ground up, or even if you've come into a situation where you're a hiring manager or you have visibility into that, I think many of us have seen situations where we're bringing in operators, we're bringing in blue teamers, defenders, and we're expecting all of these things from them. As a defender, you have to be part analyst, part data scientist, investigator, engineer, user support specialist, right? Intel analyst in some cases. And yet, we expect someone to be all of those things on day one. And then in many cases, when we talk about that sustainment model, we often expect those people to sit down and look at alerts, monitor this email inbox, listen, field user complaints, right? And those things are okay. And those things might be part of the job. But there's a fundamental mismatch there in what we expect, right? What we expect on day one, right out of the gate, and then what we expect those individuals to do relative to our initial expectations. So I think that's really what we have to address, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Fortunately, we are not the A-team from the TV show. We don't have to break out of a federal stockade. We don't have to break out of jail where we're wrongly imprisoned, right? We just have to be able to navigate these particular challenges, right? And fight our way into building that high-performing team. So before we get started on doing that, there are a few fundamental considerations that I think set the stage for this kind of discussion, right? We need to think about direction, right? Where are we trying to go? And the answer to that is not, we're just trying to get up and running, right? And then it's smooth sailing. No, where strategically are we trying to go? What value are we trying to bring to our organization? What is our purpose? What's the SOC charter, right? What are we here to do? How are we going to foster teamwork and build interpersonal relationships, the kind of relationships we need to enable our team to work together? How are we prepared to coach that team, right? Make sure that we're staying on track, that we're reaching those goals. There's a really good book out there by Simon Sinek called The Infinite Game. And it talks about this concept of zealots and mercenaries, right? So what we want to do is foster zealots. We want people that believe in what we're doing, right? If not the mission and the cause, at least believe in what the team is doing day to day, right? Believe in that concept of teamwork and being part of a group, something that's bigger than themselves. We don't necessarily want to build a team of mercenaries that are only out for themselves, right? Take the paycheck, move on as soon as another better opportunity comes along, right? So foster zealots, not mercenaries. And above all, as leaders, as defenders, as analysts, we need to have a readiness to prove ourselves. And that doesn't mean that we need to crush ourselves, trying to show what we can do and show what we know. We need to be ready to admit that maybe we don't know everything, that there are smarter people out there that we can learn from each other, right? So be ready to prove yourself, be ready to jump in and learn, right? Bring your particular set of knowledge and skills, your background to the table, see how you can use that for the betterment of your team. So hopefully we all have the right mindset, right? We're ready to jump in, start building that SOC A team. So the first step here in getting started, right, we need to answer some questions. The first question we need to answer is, What are we trying to do? What is our business doing? I've run into many situations where you have a security team that knows very well what they're supposed to be doing day to day, right? They know what they're about, but they can't for the life of them describe what value their organization creates. Sure, maybe I work at a manufacturing company, or maybe I work at a government agency and they do X, Y, and Z. That's great. But when's the last time, if you're a defender, that you really dug into what your organization does to create value, right? What are the big developments that are on the horizon? What things are they working on? What are their competitors, right? How can you enable the business to maintain the edge in whatever it is they're doing and allow them to do that in a secure way? We have to plan to experiment and iterate. Team building can be very messy. Interpersonal relationships, team dynamics, those things are relatively soft. So we have to be ready to experiment with different things, different incentives, different metrics and measurements, and be prepared to iterate over time. I'm a big fan of treating the SOC as a platform that you're constantly refining, right? You're putting out new releases of what the SOC is, right? With different processes, different measures. You have to be ready to iterate to get the right balance of all those things. Servant leadership, very, very important, right? For those of you that were fortunate enough to watch the A-Team, Hannibal Smith was the leader of the A-Team. And he wasn't back in some bunker or base directing his team to do these missions, right? To try to clear their names and go through all these adventures, from afar. He was right there with them. And while you might not be a technical, hands-on type of leader, right? Think about how you can enable your team, right? Kind of lead from the front, as opposed to sit back and direct from afar. How do we show results? What metrics are we going to use to demonstrate that we're not just sinking back into that sustainment mentality, right? That we're getting somewhere. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a few minutes. And finally, in order for a plan to come together, you have to have a plan. And the plan can't be, we're going to get up and running. We're going to get to where, we can look at sim events, to where we can open tickets and escalate them. That's great. That's also the first step. Where are you going to go from there? What's your plan? So now we've got a right mindset. We have our plan. Right now it's time to build the team. And this is a concept that I like to refer to. It is by no means scientific in any way. And it's represented here in two boxes. Right? Now pay attention, because there's going to be a quiz on this later. Think of these two boxes as two ends of a spectrum for the A-Team that we're going to build. In terms of people, we can have a talent-centric model, or we can have a mission-centric model. Right? Now, I'll describe these in more detail on the next slide. But basically, your talent-centric model is what I like to refer to as superhero syndrome. So you have one individual or a few individuals that are providing the majority of the technical expertise, possibly the majority of the vision for the team, what it's supposed to look like, how it works. And they're really driving what the team is doing on any given day. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a mission-centric model. This is a team that's built to fulfill a certain function. And it matters less, right? It still matters, but it matters less about the individuals on the team and what they're driving. It's more about organizational drivers, what the organization requires. So I'm going to describe these now. I want you all to think about where your team, if you're in a cyber defense team or a blue team or a SOC, think about where your team falls in this spectrum. Which end are you closer to? Okay, now seriously, listen to this. We're going to have a quiz, right? On the talent-centric side. By the way, neither of these are right or wrong. It's more of just an observation of team dynamics. So in a talent-centric dynamic, that might be where you need to go if you want to get more capability near term. If you need seasoned, experienced defenders to jump in, really get going with minimal preparation, minimal build out. At the same time, your capacity is going to be limited, right? If you're relying on these rock stars, on these superheroes, whatever you want to call them, You're only going to be able to scale as far as those individuals can work. So your capacity to scale and do lots of different things at once, handle a heavy workload, it's going to be limited. Bias, turnover, right, become a bigger problem when you're more heavily reliant on a few individuals. Right? If you have one person or a few people driving workflows on your team, guess what? You're probably going to be focused on what those individuals want to be focused on. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, mission-centric organizations, and I don't want to pick on public sector or the federal sector, but I often see this in kind of contract-driven environments like federal contracts, like federal agencies. This is where the processes and the team structure and really everything about how the team operates is well defined up front. You will do these things. You're going to monitor these tools. When you see something, you're going to escalate it in this way, right? With these SLAs. Sometimes this structure can be a lot less flexible. It can leave less room for creativity for the team to decide how best to handle, a given issue, a given incident, a given failure. And not always, but often, there's a risk of missing the forest for the trees, right? Sure, you might be a very mature organization if you're very highly structured in this way, perhaps structured, by a contract or by a statement of work, right? Might be very mature. But what I often see in these types of organizations is they don't have a lot of capability. And that kind of sounds weird to say, right? But you might have these documented, repeatable processes, but still miss things because you're not enabling your team to be creative and to break outside of those bounds when needed to do what needs to be done. So we'll come back to this in a little bit. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, where you need to fall, when you're building your team, you start bringing in those A players, you want to focus on attracting things like aptitude, right? The right kind of attitude. Remember, this is a team sport, at least it is on the defender side, right? So we need the right kinds of attitudes to come together, right? Operate well as a team. The desire has to be there. Remember, we're looking for zealots, not mercenaries. We want that drive, that desire to learn, to get better, right? To be creative. That's what we're looking for. And we need a diverse team. And I mean that in every sense of the word, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds, lots of different types of people, lots of different perspectives. Many studies shown that indicate that diversity of thought makes for much better analytic results. And that's what we want, right? Things we want to avoid. This is one of my favorites. I'm sure none of you have opinions on this. Over-reliance on experience or education or credentials. I'm a big fan. Obviously, I teach for SANS. I believe in what they do. I'm a big fan of certifications and training and professional development, but we don't want to rely on those to the extent that we lose great candidates, right? So we don't want to over-rely. Those are good data points. They're not the be-all, end-all in finding quality people. We need to look out for this E word. And I know no one listening to me right now has an issue with this at all, right? But for those other people that are not on this talk, that have big egos, right? We need to kind of look out for that because sometimes that can hamper good teamwork, okay? And misrepresentation. Again, we need all different kinds of people with all different kinds of backgrounds, okay? But what we don't need are folks who are going to come in and maybe misrepresent what we know, right? That's not a great starting point. So when you're looking for great candidates, for building out this team, right, look out for misrepresentation. Now I can do an entire talk, and in fact, there's a whole channel in CircleCityCon, right, for looking at resumes and helping folks be prepared to go through the interview process. But whatever your process is, and it can vary greatly from one organization to another, right, we might not have a lot of control over what that process looks like. But one thing that I have found is universal in most hiring scenarios is we're asking questions, right? We're trying to get to know people in a very limited span of time, right? So you want to ask the right types of questions. Okay, if we want to find these zealots, people with the kinds of diverse backgrounds and diversity of thought that we want, we have to ask the right kinds of questions. And this table is taken from an academic paper that was released by Department of Homeland Security and George Mason University and a few others recently that talked about strong team dynamics in computer incident response teams. And I thought it was a great description of the kinds of questions and the kinds of responses that you want to look for in the hiring process when you're trying to find great people. So I'm not going to read this to you. You can see it on the screen, but you want to ask open-ended, kind of scenario-oriented questions. And these are elements of strong responses to those questions. You want some specificity. You want to ask about processes and have candidates be able to describe things in order and understand the rationale. And it really doesn't matter what those things are, right? Talk to me about how you solved a problem, right? How you built a tool, how you responded to an incident or identified an incident, whatever it is, right? They need to express an understanding of the rationale behind doing what they did. Talk about whether or not they were able to follow that process, or maybe where they had to get creative and deviate from that process and why. And hopefully they can talk to you about things that they identified that they could improve in that process. Again, whatever it is, right? Some red flag responses. I don't really know why I did this or why we do this where I work today. I just kind of follow it blindly and I don't really get the rationale behind it. Or real red flag, we have a process for analyzing malware, but I don't really follow that. Right? It's onerous, or I don't understand it, so I don't do it. Right? We want to kind of look out for those things. Or this process stinks. It's terrible. Right? It sucks. I don't know how to improve it. I don't really know how we could do it better. Right? Problems without solutions. Those are the kinds of things we want to look out for when we're screening candidates. So if we've navigated that, we found our great candidates, right, we're ready to bring the team together, start really building that capability. It's time to think about training. And there are lots of great resources out there for professional development and training. Whatever we're using, training is really, really important. Right? And it's not something that we should be doing upfront for a limited amount of time and then boom, we're off to the races. Right? It should be an ongoing activity, constantly refining our skills, refining our ability to work together as a team. Okay. And in doing that, and some of this is based off of the research and the writings of Chris Sanders, who many of you may be familiar with, does a lot of work on the blue team side, has written a lot of great books, published a lot of great resources, does a lot of great training. Things like technical analysis, right? Learning tools, things like search syntax, right? How to write a Splunk query, how to navigate through QRadar or Elastic, how to use Suricata. Those things can all be taught. Following an SOP can be taught relatively easily, right? How to write and follow documentation, maybe a little harder, right? But it's relatively easy to bring someone up to speed on those things. The bigger challenge is teaching things like how to think, right? Metacognition, thinking about thinking, being aware of your biases, right? How to communicate well with others, investigative theory, right? What are the business implications of what we're doing? Again, in my experience, not in all cases, we focus a little bit too much on the things that are easier to teach and less so on the things that are harder to teach because they're hard, right? But it doesn't make them any less important. In fact, I think they're much more important, these things that are in the right-hand column than on the left, okay? And as I mentioned before, we want to start with our mission and our business. Everyone on the team should be able to describe what their charter is for the team, what value they're bringing to the business, right? What things they're concerned about at a high level. What's the organization's threat model? What are the things that could impact that value, right? What's the environment, the larger business environment or the organizational environment that they're operating in? If you're wondering where to start on the non-technical training, start there. Another area that I think we often skip over is collaborative problem solving. And this is also from that academic paper, the joint academic paper between DHS and GMU and others. There was a big focus on the more effective teams training in collaborative problem solving, working together, right, to address issues, respond to incidents, do security analysis in a collaborative way. And these are some things that can strengthen that collaborative problem solving. First thing, conducting pre-briefings for incident response or structured threat hunts. Right? Don't just turn everybody loose and have them go off and do, whatever it is they're going to do. Right? In every episode of the A-Team, there would be kind of a challenge or a big problem that the team had to solve. And sometimes they would go off on their own and do their own parts of the mission, right? But inevitably, they would come back together, right, to work as a team to, blast through that ambush or break out of a barn that they were trapped in or whatever it was, right? And they didn't just go off and do that and expect that everyone was going to handle their piece of it, right, without some sort of structured conversation, sometimes maybe off screen, but this is what we should be doing every time the team is going to go off and do something like an incident response, right, like a structured hunt. Conduct a pre-briefing, talk about the goals, roles and responsibilities, issues and risks, what we expect the outcomes to be, things like that. On the back end, conduct structured debriefs of everything you found, right? Did any of those issues pop up? Do we have any challenges, right? Do we run into any organizational roadblocks? Things won't improve unless you're conducting those kinds of reviews after the fact so you can improve. Train, train, train. This is something that has been beaten into me from my previous life in the military, which is if you're not on a mission, if you're not engaged, then you're training to be engaged. You're training to be on the mission, right? So to the extent that you can, conduct simulations. We've got a great talk, in fact, I think one that's happening right now about purple teaming and doing those kinds of simulations. And even if you don't have the resources to do more structured reviews like a purple team, or maybe you don't have a red team that you can work with, look for ways to walk the team through scenarios. Do some tabletop exercises, write up some scenarios, and walk the team through those scenarios verbally, if nothing else. And make sure you're giving focused feedback to your team members. Right? Conduct those one-on-ones. When you go through these simulations or when you're doing your debriefs, right, you're going to see that people have challenges, right? Maybe challenges communicating, challenges doing some of the technical work. Make sure you give them that focused feedback early and often, directly, one-on-one. And then finally, a pro tip when it comes to training, no matter what you're doing for training, it helps to spend at least some time training your own people and letting them train together. I've been a part of many teams, right, and I've assessed many teams where the organization is spending a lot of money sending individuals off. And the thinking is, well, they'll go off and, this one person will take this very focused training and they'll come back and kind of share what they know, and it'll sort of, by osmosis kind of spread out to the team. And in my experience, that doesn't really work. You have to spend some time letting the team train together, right, in order for them to build up that shared knowledge. So we've got a really highly trained team, right? We've got the right personalities. We've got some really good kind of diversity, lots of different perspectives on the team, right? We're starting to come together and function as a group. So how do we keep everybody motivated? How do we keep everybody on the job, right? It is a competitive landscape out there. Even now, right, where a lot of people are getting impacted by kind of the downturn and everything that's happening. Some people are getting laid off, right? It's still a competitive sector. So how do we motivate people and try to keep, the good folks that we've made all of these investments in, right? First up, we want to keep, a little bit of healthy competition can be a great thing, and it can be a great motivator. But we also want to build this kind of no competition zone, right? We're all a team at the end of the day. It's not about, who is doing better than who did what, right? Everything's a team effort. So we need to foster that sort of collaborative, no competition zone. I talked about the superhero syndrome, right? That talent-centric model. And sometimes that's necessary. I'm going to talk about some case studies in a few minutes where I personally kind of had to go that talent-centric route to get the results that I wanted. But that's not great for long-term retention, because when that talent inevitably moves on, right, takes another opportunity, your capability is going to crater. That's going to have a huge impact. So shifting tasks around, letting people cross-train, occupy different roles, even if that's temporary, it's a great way to hero-proof your organization, your team. On the A team, everybody had their specialties. You had team members that were really good at building things, right, or destroying things. You had team members that were great at social engineering, right? Team members that were great at planning. It was a pilot, right? Lots of different skill sets, but they were all able to, in some cases, switch and kind of do each other's job, right? And they were a stronger team for it. Celebrate small wins. So much of what we do in running and building and being part of security teams, I know you all are going to be sad to hear it. I'm kind of sad to say it. It's a sales job, right? We have to sell what we're doing, sometimes to our own team, right? We have to sell what we're doing, certainly to management, to stakeholders that are footing the bills for what we're doing, right? So we need to celebrate those small wins. Did we add a new capability? Did we drive some of our metrics further into the area that we want them to be? We need to look for opportunities to sell what we're doing, celebrate those wins. I've talked about collaboration and creativity several times already, but we need to look for ways to promote that. And if you're not doing that in a purposeful, kind of structured way, it's really easy, once that empowerment, once that creativity starts to falter, it's going to gain momentum, and it's going to be much harder to reintroduce that back into the team if you're not maintaining it. Talking about empowering, we have to make sure that we're empowering and equipping our team to do what's important. There's this concept called, named after Dwight Eisenhower. It's called the Eisenhower Matrix. And if you were to look up the Eisenhower Matrix, I don't have a picture in here, but it's a way of organizing tasks into things that are urgent and important. And some tasks might be very important, but they're not particularly urgent. Some tasks might be urgent, but not particularly important. So for example, if one of your responsibilities on the security team is monitoring the spam inbox, and I do often see that weirdly in security teams, is monitoring spam. That might not be particularly important, but maybe you have an SLA around taking some action, right, to monitor that. So that is something that is urgent, not particularly important. Okay, and what we want to do as leaders, right, even if we're a part of a larger team, we want to try to drive towards focusing on things that are important, even if they're not urgent, right? Keep as much of our attention, as many of our resources on those things as we can. And it can be difficult because, as we all know, in security, everything's urgent, right? So we have to try to empower our team to work through that, focus on what is not only urgent, but is important. So how do we measure what we're doing? Right? You can't manage what you can't measure. And this happens to be kind of a favorite topic of mine in security operations because I'm a nerd. Key performance indicators and a lesser known type of metric, objectives and key results, OKRs. So most of us, if you're part of a security team, you've got KPIs to instrument your operation, whether that's time-based metrics, how you're doing, what are the numbers and types of incidents that you're responding to, how many changes you're making in the environment, things like that. They instrument your operation on a day-to-day basis. OKRs, which I think were pioneered at Intel many years ago, they tie your operations to a larger strategy. So what are our strategic objectives, things that we want to do, and what are the key results we have to see in order to reach those objectives? Okay. How will your training and your mentorship that you're doing drive improvements in these areas, right? Everything that you're doing should improve your KPIs. And if you have OKRs, they should improve those as well. So let's talk about those in a little bit more detail. So sample KPIs, again, most of us have this kind of thing in our security teams, right? Some examples might be, coverage, right? Or your visibility for monitoring. It might be your time to respond, remediate, or contain intrusions. If you wanted to introduce OKRs, into your measurements. Some examples might be, a strategic objective of our security team is we want to reduce successful social engineering attacks, right? So how do we do that? What KPIs do we need to be seeing to bring, successful social engineering attacks kind of back into the range that we want to see, right? Hopefully it's 0, probably won't ever get there, but what is an acceptable level? Maybe we want to reduce identification and response time, right? So that is a point in time, finite goal. We want to get it down to, this time or less. So let's focus on that, right? OKRs, right, can be used to bring those KPIs into the desired range, right? We want to get time to respond down to 0, or, down to whatever. So let's see. When we're measuring people, if you listened to Alyssa's keynote yesterday, you heard her talk about using fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, right, to communicate issues to management, and how that doesn't really work. It's not a good motivator. So similarly, when you're measuring your people and you're trying to motivate them, right, we want to inform, we want to empower, right, not penalize. That doesn't mean you don't correct issues when you see them. It doesn't mean you don't enforce good discipline when you need to, but we don't want to build assembly lines. That's not what we're doing here, right? Remember, this is an expert kind of task. So we want to look for, measurements, goals, metrics that motivate and that measure, not penalize. We want to prepare our team members for future success, right? Prepare them to handle change. So there are going to be lots of organizational changes that as a security team, we're not going to have control over, right? Mergers and acquisitions, budget changes, things that are going to impact us, and we need to be prepared for that. So if we lose our fancy new tool that everybody loves and we have to make do with some other lesser alternative, we still have to be able to do our jobs and be successful. So think about that when you're planning your training, what you're going to focus on, right? When you're planning out your SOPs and how the team works. And above all, everything changes, right? Semper Gumby, prepare to be flexible, prepare your team to handle change. So I've mentioned this paper a few times from DHS and George Mason University and several other groups. That paper is Improving Social Maturity of Cybersecurity Incident Response Teams. And if you're in any kind of leadership or management role, highly recommend you read that. It's a great paper. There's lots of good stuff in there. But now I want to take a few minutes to talk about challenges that we're going to run into. And the first set of challenges are described in this paper. They're called collaboration chillers. And that might sound like, the new Mountain Dew flavor. I don't know how much I like that phrase, but I think the concept is really sound, right? Look through this list if you're on a security team and count how many of these things you have in your team or you've seen as a problem. Failure to share information, right? Not initiating collaboration, just kind of staying focused, head down, right? Doing what we're doing, right? Focused on our own stuff, not really looking to bring other people in or enable others. Not adapting to change, we just talked about that. Not communicating, not trusting our teammates. Interpersonal conflicts, right? Those are going to be natural in any kind of team environment, right? So that's going to be a challenge no matter what. Lack of knowledge about team member expertise. I want to talk about this in a little bit more depth, right? This paper also introduces the concept of SKU, shared knowledge of unique expertise. And I've seen this problem a lot in security teams. I've never heard it given a name like this. So I really like this concept. We want to foster and improve, SKU, this shared knowledge of who knows what, right? So you should be able to look at your team, and every team member should be able to look around and say, if I have an issue with, this type of malware, or I have an issue that is specific to Windows environments or Linux environments, or I have an issue, kind of bringing vulnerability management, kind of into where we need it to be. Right? Who has expertise in those areas? Who has background in those areas, right? Where is that unique expertise and how do I tap into it, right? This is going to require knowledge tools, right? If you have a wiki, a knowledge base, some kind of knowledge management system, right? This is where those things come in. I mentioned task shifting and cross-training. This is where that is really important because those skills are going to come out, right? People are going to be more aware of the knowledge gaps that we have and how different teammates can come in and fill those gaps. And I also talked about those after action reviews, right? Incredibly important. Hey, we missed this. We kind of stumbled on doing some of this, static analysis of the sample. But hey, so-and-so over here actually, is really good at that. And we should have gotten that sample to so-and-so, much faster, things like that. Some other challenges that we're going to run into building our A team. An inward focus. Again, I'm sure no one on this stream has a problem with this, right? Focusing only on what we do or what our team does, right? At the expense of what's going on around us. I'm sure none of us have that challenge, but it is out there. Some teams do run into this, so you got to look out for that. Role-oriented bias, right? I have an Intel background, so now everything to me is an Intel problem, okay? That's pretty common, especially if you have scenarios where individuals are specialized in different areas. Conflict, lack of trust, lack of empowerment. Nothing will kill a team faster, even a very highly skilled team, than a lack of empowerment to do things, right? To take action, to respond to something they're seeing, right? We need to make sure folks are empowered. Here's what you can do to address these issues. First, right? Not everyone is social. Not everyone is extroverted or outgoing, and that's fine. But to the extent that you can, you got to foster interaction and social connections of some kind, right? Even if it's leading a, kind of non-work related discussion, you have a Slack channel or Discord channel for non-work stuff, where people can kind of talk about things, right? Get to know each other a little better. Set and communicate clear goals, clear roles, clear standards. We talked about having a plan. Make sure the team knows what that plan is, that the team knows how well that they're doing to achieve those goals, right? To execute that plan. You all as leaders in whatever you're doing on the defensive side, you need to exemplify these communication norms, right? So create a safe space for communication. Okay, share often, right? Be transparent as possible. You are going to set the tone for the culture within your team, right? So consider that when you're making decisions. And we talked about doing exercises, simulations, purple teaming, tabletops, things like that. You got to push the team out of their comfort zone. Not too far, not all the time, but people are at their most creative, right? And they feel most empowered when they're learning new things, or they're slightly pushed outside of their background, their skill set, what they're used to doing. That helps maintain that flexibility, helps people grow and learn. And that's what we're all about. So I'm going to round out the talk today just by sharing some anecdotes from my experience that touch on some of the things that we've talked about building these A teams. I'm going to talk about how I have tried to build my own A teams in some cases, very successfully in some cases, learned a lot. Starting with back in 2008, I was brought in to build a 24/7 security operations center for the executive branch. If you stare really closely at the slide, you might see a hint, or heard what I was saying earlier at, about where this was. But had to build out the 24/7 SOC. Some of the challenges coming right in: very small budget for this agency. So despite its visibility, this agency had a very small operating budget because it was small organizationally. It was an organization in flux. So again, this was 2008. It was about a month before the administration was transitioning from one to the other. So lots of changes. If you're familiar at all with the executive branch, you know that the Presidential Records Act dictates that at the end of an administration, every piece of data, that's every hard drive, every document, everything is gathered, collected, and sent off to National Archives, and we basically start from scratch. right? So a lot of stuff happening, not just organizationally, but also from a data and information perspective. And this was a brand new SOC. This agency did not have any kind of security operations capability, basically had a couple of federal employees that were effectively their security team. So one other challenge that I didn't mention on the previous slide as well is I was the last person to be brought in. So I was handed my team, I was handed my tool set, I was handed my contract. I was a contractor leading a contract team. So not a lot of chances or opportunity to be creative, be flexible with what we were doing. It's kind of given the team, given the capability and told, okay, go do this with these people and these tools. So how did I build this SOC A team out of being handed a lot of these things that may or may not have been purpose built for a function, let's just say. The first thing that I learned very quickly is that we had a very, very savvy customer. So the federal employees that I was working for at the time were really sharp. They were very technical. They had had some incident activity in the past and had handled that. They had built out their entire security stack. So very, very capable. They knew what was going on. So we had to work hard to kind of tell stories that interested them. So, hey, we really got our SIM, tuned really well, and good signal to noise ratio. We've got our case management, kind of in order, right? That's all good. That wasn't the most exciting thing to them, right? So we had to adopt very quickly a more intel-oriented focus, right? Talk about things like state-sponsored activities that were maybe impacting other similar agencies or this agency. We looked at VIPs that were being targeted. This agency has a lot of sub-agencies where they're sending VIPs all over the world. So, their kind of threat profile is very, very unique in that sense. So we kind of tailored the program to focus on some of those unique challenges. We also had to be very focused on the customer. So the new administration coming in at the time was kind of upending a lot of the norms around how this organization functioned relative to things like social media and being visible and engaging with the public, right? And so we had to build kind of and tailor what we had technology-wise around those use cases. So a big example of that is Facebook at the time was a huge mechanism for engaging with the public, and previously had been just completely blocked, right? So we had to figure out kind of how to creatively enable the access that the administration users wanted without compromising some of the things that we had to do from a privacy and security and data retention perspective. One thing that I learned here in trying to build a high-performing team in this kind of environment is we often think as security practitioners that we're smarter than everybody in the room. I mean, not everybody on this talk, right? But other people certainly sometimes think that, right? That's not always going to be the case, right? In some cases, your customer, they brought you there, right? They know maybe much better than you do what the tools are, what the mission is, right? Where the bodies are buried, so to speak. So you have to find ways to be, air quotes, smarter than your customer, right? In order to bring value to them. What are some insights, some things that you and your team can do, right, to bring value to the organization that is not there before? And it's not always going to be, well, we're really smart, we know things about security. Second case study, fast forward a few years, and I was part of an organization that did a lot of threat hunting and incident response and forensics type consulting work. And our customers, this was back around 2012, our customers were clamoring for some kind of ongoing managed service kind of augmentation, not in the traditional MSSP sense, but they wanted kind of this threat hunting as a service. So we built out a managed service, which 1 or 2 years after the fact, I think Gartner coined the phrase MDR, Managed Detection and Response Provider. But before that was really much of a thing, we built out this early service to provide that kind of expert support to customers on a monthly, sustained basis. So we had very clear goals with what we wanted to do with a service like this. We didn't have a lot of processes, so we had to bring in kind of an expert team to just make things happen really fast. So remember, I talked about that talent-centric model versus the mission-centric model. So in the previous case study, that executive branch agency, that was very much a mission-centric model. We had to do what that customer wanted in the way that they wanted it done, right, with very little deviation. Okay, so that was very much a mission-centric type of environment. Here was almost the opposite type of scenario. There really wasn't a lot of structure. There were no kind of guardrails. There was nothing that came before that told us how this kind of thing would work. So my strategy here was to adopt that talent-centric kind of focus, make sure that I just had really, really good, capable, smart people to get in and do quality work, and then build the structure around that, kind of building the plane as it's going down the runway, so to speak. So the way that we attacked this problem and grew our customer base and ultimately made this MDR offering successful is starting small. Again, looking for those quick wins, right? Find good fishing holes, right? Good ways of threat hunting and finding compelling things in these customer environments, and then building from there. And building up really strong supporting functions like research and development, project management, try to add some of the structure, bring us away from being so heavily reliant on a handful of really talented individuals, and finding a way to achieve more maturity, more kind of reliable, repeatable successes. So in this example, my A team looked like a bunch of great utility players that could do a lot of different things and do them well. I also needed them to be really good communicators, right? We were talking to external customers a lot, and in some cases, having conversations that we'd never had before. So good communication skills was very important here. Good customer support skills were very important. And ultimately, we needed to foster a generative environment. So we all, physically worked in the same room, very open kind of communications, a lot of team building, a lot of bringing the team together outside of the office, and doing a lot of kind of structured activities to build that collaborative and generative environment where everybody hopefully felt comfortable bringing up new ideas, new ways of doing things. Hey, we haven't really thought about this, but I'm seeing it with a lot of my customers. Let's build something to address that challenge, right? Fostering new ideas, really, really, really important in that environment. So to summarize, when our plan comes together, right, we love when that happens. Talent can be found in a lot of different places, and it's less important where those places are. We don't want to be very narrow-minded in how we look for it, but when we find it, we want to know that we have it, how to identify it, how to foster it, retain it. Ultimately, the difference between an A team and the other team, right, is going to be these things: how well the team works together, cohesion, how flexible it is, right, how resilient in the face of change. And you want to be able to see measurable results, right? The proof is going to be in the pudding. How well is the team executing its mission? Are we getting where we need to go? Are we staying out of that kind of sustainment rut, or we're just sort of doing the same things day in and day out? And here are some other resources that, if you're focused on building and leading teams, that I find to be very useful. I would be remiss if I did not plug SANS Sec 450, which I think, of course, I'm very biased, but I think it's a fantastic course if you have the means to take it. A lot of great information, even if you've been working on the blue team for a long time. There's also SANS Management 551, which is another course written by John Hubbard, who wrote 450 as well. 551 is in beta. It's a 2-day course on building and leading SOCs. Some really great content there. Really anything written by Chris Sanders or produced by him, you cannot go wrong. Any of his books on security operations. He also does a lot of really great research and writing on the intersection between psychology and security operations, which are really fantastic. There are a lot of free resources out there in the SOC Summit presentation archive that SANS maintains. A lot of great presentations and papers there. And then finally, this is getting to be somewhat of an oldie, but still a goodie. MITRE's 10 strategies for building world-class security cyber operations is a free ebook that's out there that, although it's a few years old at this point, I think is still a great resource, very relevant to building and running teams. So I told you that there was going to be a quiz on the talent-centric and mission-centric. Fortunately for you all, it is a take-home quiz. So that pop quiz, is your team more talent-centric or is it more mission-centric? Think about that. And when you answer that question, think about whether or not that's what you really need and whether or not that's the best fit for your organization. And if the answer is no, what can you do to bring it more in the other direction? Make sure you schedule one-on-ones with your team. If you don't do that, go in on Monday morning or log on Monday morning and do that right away. It's very, very important. When you're doing those one-on-ones, ask your team members to talk about the SOC charter, what they're protecting, and then look for ways to remove some of the barriers, navigate the challenges we talked about that stand in the way of good communications, good teamwork, and find an opportunity to conduct a structured pre-briefing, whether that's just for an exercise or a scenario-based simulation, or if you have an incident pop up or a case that you're working, try doing a more structured activity to foster that open communication and that teamwork. And finally, let's keep in touch. You can find me on Twitter, fairly active there at Mark A. Orlando. And with that, I'll thank you all again very much for joining. I think we're about at time. Maybe we might have a minute or so for questions, but you can always find me on Twitter as well.